Ethan Reynolds had spent his entire career making decisions worth billions of dollars without ever second-guessing himself. But that morning, sitting in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking Manhattan, watching his phone screen beneath the conference table, his hands were shaking. What he saw on the hidden camera feed wasn't supposed to be possible. His mother was laughing. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's get to the story. Ethan was sitting at the head of a massive glass conference table on the 42nd floor of the Reynolds Group headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, the city stretched out in every direction, a forest of steel and ambition glittering in the late morning sun. Around the table, 12 senior executives were taking turns presenting quarterly projections, merger opportunities, and expansion strategies that would reshape entire markets. Numbers flickered across the presentation screen. 7-figure investments. 9-figure returns. The kind of figures that once made Ethan's pulse quicken with the thrill of conquest. Now they barely registered. He nodded at the right moments, asked the occasional sharp question that kept everyone on edge. To the people in that room, Ethan Reynolds was exactly what he had always been. Untouchable, unshakable, a man who controlled empires without ever showing a crack in his armor. But beneath the tailored Tom Ford suit and the calm expression he wore like a mask, Ethan's attention had drifted somewhere else entirely. For 6 months now, work had been the only place where he could pretend everything was normal. Boardrooms, negotiations, deals, these were languages he still spoke fluently. They followed rules he understood. They demanded strategy, not emotion. Here, he didn't have to think about the house in Greenwich where his childhood had unfolded, now converted into something that looked more like a private medical facility than a home. He didn't have to think about wheelchairs or physical therapists or the sound of silence where music used to live. The phone in his jacket pocket vibrated. Ethan's jaw tightened. No one interrupted Ethan Reynolds during executive meetings. His assistant knew better. His lawyers knew better. Even his board members knew that when he was in this room, the rest of the world ceased to exist. He reached into his pocket, intending to silence whatever notification had broken through, but when his fingers closed around the phone and he glanced down at the screen, his entire body went rigid. Home security, motion detected, living room. Yeah. Ethan had installed the surveillance system himself, personally overseeing every camera placement, every angle, and every feed. He told himself it was necessary. His mother was vulnerable now, unable to move half her body, unable to call for help if something went wrong. The cameras were protection, precaution, responsibility. But even as he justified it to himself, Ethan knew the truth ran deeper and darker than that. He unlocked his phone beneath the edge of the table. The screen filled with the image of the living room in Greenwich, a space he had remodeled 6 months earlier with clinical precision. Cream-colored walls. Hardwood floors. Medical equipment disguised as tasteful furniture. Everything designed for function, nothing left to chance. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting soft rectangles of light across the Persian rug his mother had chosen decades ago, back when she could still walk across it. And there, near the window overlooking the garden she used to tend, sat Margaret Reynolds in her wheelchair. Her legs were motionless beneath a pale blue blanket. Her right hand rested uselessly in her lap, fingers curled inward in the permanent half-fist the stroke had left behind. But her left hand, still functional, was moving. And her face, the face Ethan had been avoiding for half a year because he couldn't bear to see the light gone from it, was transformed. She was smiling. Not the polite, distant smile she gave doctors when they asked how she was feeling. Not the sad, apologetic smile she wore when nurses repositioned her in the chair. This was something Ethan hadn't seen since before the stroke. It was real. Unguarded. Alive. Her shoulders were shaking slightly, and even though the app didn't transmit sound clearly, Ethan could see her mouth forming the shapes of laughter. His heart slammed against his ribs so hard he thought the CFO sitting across from him might hear it. Standing directly in front of Margaret was Lucia Alvarez, the housekeeper Ethan had hired barely 2 weeks ago. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of calm, watchful eyes that saw more than people expected. Ethan had barely spoken to her beyond the initial interview. She was just another employee, just another part of the machinery he'd assembled to keep his mother alive while he kept his distance. But now, on the small screen beneath the conference table, Lucia was holding something Ethan recognized immediately. The music box. It was small, wooden, hand-painted with faded flowers. His father had given it to Margaret on their 10th wedding anniversary, and for years it had sat on her piano, a decoration more than anything. Ethan hadn't seen it since the stroke. He assumed it had been packed away with everything else that belonged to the version of his mother who no longer existed. Lucia wound the tiny key on the side of the box carefully, almost reverently. Then she set it down on the coffee table in front of Margaret. Even through the grainy phone screen, Ethan could see the delicate mechanism inside begin to turn. He couldn't hear the melody, but he didn't need to. He had heard it 1,000 times as a child. Lucia knelt. Not beside the wheelchair. Not standing over Margaret like every nurse and therapist who came through that house. She knelt directly in front of the chair, lowering herself until she was looking up slightly, until Margaret was the one with the higher vantage point. Then Lucia reached out and placed her hands gently, impossibly gently, over Margaret's twisted right hand. Ethan watched, unable to breathe, as Lucia leaned closer and said something. Margaret's expression shifted. The smile deepened. Her eyes filled with tears, but not the hopeless kind Ethan had seen too many times. These were different. And then, so faintly that Ethan almost missed it, Margaret's fingers twitched. Not a spasm. Not an accident. Intentional. The boardroom disappeared. The voices around him faded into static. Ethan forgot where he was, forgot the presentation, forgot the acquisition deal they were supposed to be finalizing. All he could see was his mother's face, lit with something he thought the stroke had stolen forever. All he could feel was the terrible, crushing weight of 6 months spent watching her through screens instead of sitting beside her. 6 months of surveillance. 6 months of control. And a stranger had given her back her laughter in less than 2 weeks. Ethan? The CFO's voice cut through the fog. Ethan looked up sharply, suddenly aware that everyone at the table was staring at him. He had no idea how long he'd been silent. Seconds? Minutes? He didn't know what question he'd missed or what response they were waiting for. He knew only one thing with absolute certainty. He could not stay in this room for another second. Ethan stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. He grabbed his coat from the back of his seat and his phone from the table. 12 pairs of eyes tracked his movement, confusion spreading across their faces like ripples in water. "I need to leave," Ethan said, his voice tight and unsteady. "Right now." The CFO blinked. "We're in the middle of..." "Reschedule it." Ethan didn't wait for permission. He didn't offer explanations or apologies. He turned and walked toward the double doors at the end of the boardroom, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Behind him, someone tried to call his name again, but he didn't stop. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. The hallway stretched out in front of him, long and sterile and empty. Ethan moved quickly toward the elevators, but even as his body carried him forward, his mind was already somewhere else. It was being pulled violently backward, dragged through 6 months of carefully constructed distance, all the way back to the beginning. Back to the hospital. Back to the hallway that smelled of antiseptic and fear, where a doctor with kind eyes and terrible news had explained, very gently, exactly what the stroke had taken from Margaret Reynolds. Back to the moment Ethan had made a choice. And now, standing alone in the executive corridor of a building he owned, staring at his reflection in the polished steel of the elevator doors, Ethan finally understood what that choice had cost him. The elevator descended 42 floors, but Ethan's mind traveled much farther back. 6 months earlier, he had stood in a different hallway in a different building, this one smelling of disinfectant and the particular sterile coldness that only hospitals possess. It was 3 a.m. Outside the tall windows, Manhattan glittered with indifferent beauty, the city carrying on as it always did, unaware that inside Mount Sinai Hospital, Ethan Reynolds' entire world was collapsing. The neurologist was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of gentle competence that came from delivering devastating news too many times. She had led Ethan to a small consultation room with beige walls and uncomfortable chairs, the kind of room designed for conversations no one wanted to have. She sat across from him, her hands folded on the table between them, and explained what the stroke had done. The left hemisphere of Margaret's brain had been starved of oxygen for approximately 11 minutes before the paramedics arrived. 11 minutes. The number felt impossibly small to contain such catastrophic damage. The stroke had attacked the motor cortex, the part of the brain that controlled movement on the right side of her body. Her right arm, her right leg gone. Not dead, the doctor clarified, but disconnected. The pathways between intention and action had been severed. She might regain some function with aggressive therapy, the doctor said. Might. Some. The words hung in the air like smoke. And then there was the dysarthria, the weakness in the muscles that controlled speech. Margaret's mind was intact, her thoughts clear, but forming words would be difficult now. Frustrating. Exhausting. She would sound different. Slower. She might slur. She might need to repeat herself. Ethan had listened to all of this with the same controlled expression he wore during hostile takeovers. He asked clinical questions about treatment options, therapy schedules, and recovery timelines. He took notes on his phone. He nodded when the doctor explained the rehabilitation process. But inside, beneath the CEO mask he had perfected over decades, something fundamental was breaking. His mother had been a pianist. Not professionally, though she could have been. She had chosen marriage and motherhood over Juilliard, a decision she claimed never to regret. But the piano had remained the center of her life. Their house in Greenwich had always been filled with music. Chopin in the mornings. Debussy in the afternoons. Rachmaninoff when she was feeling bold. Ethan had fallen asleep as a child to the sound of her playing, the melodies drifting up through the floorboards of his bedroom like lullabies. After his father died 7 years ago, the piano became even more important. It was how Margaret spoke to grief. How she processed loneliness. Ethan would call from London or Tokyo or Dubai, and she would tell him about the new piece she was learning, her voice bright with purpose. Now her right hand was curled into a useless fist. Now the piano would sit silent. Ethan had left the hospital that morning as the sun rose over the East River, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that felt obscene in their beauty. He drove to Greenwich in silence, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind carefully blank. He had learned long ago how to compartmentalize, how to lock away emotions that threatened to interfere with function. It was a survival skill that had served him well in business. He applied it now to his mother. The house felt wrong when he entered it. Too quiet. Too empty. He walked through rooms filled with Margaret's presence, her books on the shelves, her photographs on the walls, her reading glasses on the side table where she'd left them before the ambulance came. The piano sat in the sunroom, its lid closed, a stack of sheet music beside it. Chopin's nocturnes. She had been working through them again. Ethan stood in the doorway of the sunroom for a long time, staring at the instrument that had defined so much of his childhood. Then he closed the door and began making phone calls. Within 48 hours he had assembled a team. The best neurologist in New York. The top physical therapist specializing in stroke recovery. An occupational therapist. A speech therapist. A private nurse for overnight care. He scheduled consultations, arranged transport, coordinated care plans. He moved through the logistics with the same ruthless efficiency he brought to corporate acquisitions. Control felt better than helplessness. Action felt better than grief. Margaret came home 2 weeks later. Ethan had spent those 2 weeks transforming the house. The antique furniture in the living room was replaced with a medical bed that could be adjusted electronically. Grab bars appeared in the bathroom. The beautiful Persian rugs were rolled up and stored to prevent tripping hazards. A wheelchair ramp was installed at the front entrance. The piano was moved to a corner and covered with a sheet. Ethan told himself he was being practical, responsible, preparing the environment for optimal recovery. But when Margaret was wheeled through the front door and looked around at what her home had become, something in her eyes dimmed, and Ethan had to look away. The therapy began immediately. Physical therapy 3 times a week. Occupational therapy twice a week. Speech therapy twice a week. Ethan hired and fired caregivers with brutal efficiency. The first one spoke too loudly, as if Margaret's brain damage had affected her hearing. The second was too cheerful, offering relentless positivity that felt like mockery. The third treated her like a child, cutting her food into tiny pieces without asking. None of them understood that the woman in the wheelchair had once played Rachmaninoff from memory. None of them saw her the way Ethan's father had seen her. And Ethan, who should have seen her that way, who should have sat beside her and reminded her of who she was, couldn't bear to be in the same room. Because every time he looked at his mother, he saw everything she had lost. He saw the right hand that would never fly across piano keys again. He saw the words forming slowly, painfully, behind her eyes before they emerged slurred and halting from her mouth. He saw the future narrowing, possibilities closing like doors slamming shut one by one. He saw his father's absence, the empty space where his mother's partner should have been, the loneliness that no amount of hired help could fill. And beneath all of it he saw his own failure. He had been in Singapore when the stroke happened, closing a deal worth $200 million. He had ignored her calls that morning because he was in meetings. By the time he listened to her voicemail, confused and slurred, asking him to come home, she was already in the ambulance. 11 minutes without oxygen. $200 million. The math haunted him. So Ethan did what he always did when emotions threatened to overwhelm him. He built walls. He created systems. He installed controls. And 3 months after the stroke, he made a decision that would define everything that followed. He installed the cameras. Small ones, hidden in smoke detectors and picture frames and electrical outlets. Cameras in the living room, the kitchen, the bedroom, the bathroom. Feeds that ran to an app on his phone, accessible anywhere in the world. He told Margaret's primary nurse that it was a security measure, a way to monitor for falls or medical emergencies. But late at night, alone in his penthouse apartment in Manhattan, Ethan would open the app and watch his mother sleep. He would watch the night nurse check her vitals. He would watch the physical therapist guide her through exercises. He would watch her sit alone by the window, staring out at the garden she could no longer walk through. He watched her the way someone might watch a documentary about a stranger's life. Observing. Recording. Never participating. It was easier than sitting beside her. Easier than seeing the recognition in her eyes when she looked at him, the silent question she was too kind to ask aloud. Where are you? Why won't you stay? The cameras let him pretend he was protecting her. Monitoring her. Ensuring her safety. They let him maintain the illusion of control over something that had spun wildly, irreversibly out of control the moment her brain began to die. 6 months passed this way. 6 months of watching through screens. 6 months of hiring caregivers who saw only her disabilities, never her personhood. 6 months of his mother's laughter disappearing so completely that Ethan forgot what it sounded like. Until that morning in the boardroom when he saw it again. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened onto the marble lobby of Reynolds Group headquarters, where security guards nodded respectfully and executives hurried past with phones pressed to their ears. Ethan walked through them all like a ghost, seeing nothing, heading toward the parking garage where his car waited. He had spent 6 months building walls between himself and the one person who mattered most. And a stranger named Lucia Alvarez had walked through those walls in less than 2 weeks. Ethan didn't remember the drive to Greenwich. His hands moved automatically, navigating familiar roads while his mind circled the same questions over and over. What had Lucia done? What had she said? How had she reached Margaret in ways that dozens of trained professionals had failed to? How had she succeeded where he, Margaret's own son, had been too afraid to even try? The house appeared through the trees, white and elegant and carefully maintained. Ethan pulled into the circular driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the front door. Somewhere inside his mother was laughing. Somewhere inside, a woman he barely knew was kneeling on the floor, giving Margaret something Ethan had taken away. Presents. He got out of the car and walked toward the truth he had been avoiding for 6 months. Inside the house, he could hear the faint, tinny melody of the music box, and beneath it, softer but unmistakable, the sound of his mother's voice, not perfect, not smooth but alive. Ethan opened the door just as a young woman with dark hair and careful eyes was helping Margaret reach for something on the table. She looked up at the sound of his entrance, surprise flickering across her face. "Oh," she said, straightening quickly. "Mr. Reynolds. I wasn't expecting you home so early." Lucia Alvarez stood before him in a simple gray uniform, her expression cautious but not afraid. She had no idea that she had just dismantled 6 months of carefully constructed emotional architecture. She had no idea that the man staring at her from the doorway had just watched her do the impossible. She had no idea that everything was about to change. "I know," Ethan said quietly, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. "We need to talk." Ethan told himself he was being thorough. Due diligence, he called it in the privacy of his own mind, as if Lucia Alvarez were a potential acquisition that required careful scrutiny before approval. He had built an empire on the principle that trust was earned through observation, that true understanding came not from what people said but from what they did when they thought no one was watching. So he watched. The first week he told himself it was simple prudence. A new caregiver in his mother's home, someone with minimal credentials and suspiciously good references that he'd only spot-checked because the agency had seemed reputable. He owed it to Margaret to ensure this woman was competent, professional, appropriate. He opened the app during meetings, his phone face down on the conference table, glancing at it between quarterly reports and acquisition proposals. He checked it over lunch at his desk, watching Lucia move through the house with unremarkable efficiency. He reviewed the footage at night before bed, scanning through hours of recorded content at double speed, looking for red flags that never appeared. What he saw instead unsettled him in ways he couldn't articulate. Lucia didn't perform care the way the others had. There was no theatrical gentleness, no exaggerated patience, none of the performative kindness that always felt like it was meant for an invisible audience. She moved through Margaret's space with the casual comfort of someone who had been invited rather than hired. On the second day, Ethan watched Lucia wheel Margaret into the kitchen and position her at the table where she used to read the newspaper every morning. Then Lucia did something none of the previous caregivers had done. She made herself coffee, sat down across from Margaret and started talking. Not to her. With her. Ethan turned up the volume on his phone, leaning closer to the screen. I hate this weather, Lucia was saying, gesturing toward the window where February rain streaked the glass. Not the cold itself, but that specific shade of gray that makes you feel like the sun might never come back. Do you know what I mean? There was a pause. Then Margaret's voice, slow and careful but surprisingly clear, yes. My abuela used to say that February was when God got depressed, Lucia continued, stirring sugar into her coffee. She'd light extra candles, play loud music, cook with too much garlic. Her theory was that winter couldn't survive against properly seasoned food. Margaret's mouth twitched. Almost a smile. Ethan sat frozen at his desk, his hand tight around his phone. So I was thinking, Lucia said, pulling out her own phone and scrolling through something, we should probably defend against the February blues with some strategic music selection. What do you think? Should we go full defiance with something bright and ridiculous, or lean into the melancholy with something beautiful and sad? Another pause. Longer this time. Ethan could see his mother's face on the screen, the familiar furrow between her brows that meant she was thinking hard. Then, sad. Beautiful. A woman after my own heart, Lucia said, tapping her phone. Okay, let me find something appropriately devastating. A moment later, the sound of a cello filled the kitchen. Yo-Yo Ma playing Bach. Ethan recognized it immediately. His mother had played a piano arrangement of the same piece years ago. This work for you? Lucia asked. Margaret closed her eyes. Her left hand moved slightly, fingers twitching in a phantom echo of muscle memory. Yes. They sat in silence for several minutes, drinking coffee, listening to music. Not therapist and patient. Not caregiver and client. Just two people sharing space on a gray February morning. Ethan watched the entire scene without moving, something tight and uncomfortable lodged in his chest. That became Lucia's pattern. Every morning, coffee and conversation. Not therapeutic conversation designed to elicit responses or measure progress. Just talk. Normal, meandering human talk. She asked Margaret's opinion about things. Whether the living room needed more light. Which brand of tea tasted less like dishwater. If the mockingbird outside the window was showing off or just desperately lonely. She didn't wait for Margaret to finish her sentences. She didn't fill in words when Margaret struggled. She just sat there, patient but not pitying, present in a way that suggested she had nowhere more important to be. By the third day, Ethan noticed that Margaret was initiating conversations. Slow, halting questions about Lucia's family, her neighborhood, her life before she became a caregiver. And Lucia answered honestly, without the professional distance the previous caregivers had maintained. I wanted to be a teacher, she said one afternoon while helping Margaret with physical therapy exercises. Elementary school. I love the idea of being someone's favorite teacher, you know? The one they remember 30 years later. Why, didn't you? Margaret asked, the words coming slowly but clearly. Money. Lucia shrugged, guiding Margaret's left arm through a range of motion. Turns out education degrees are expensive and teaching jobs pay terribly. So I got my CNA certification instead. Shorter program, better pay. She smiled slightly. My mother says I'm still teaching, just smaller classes. I think she's trying to make me feel better about it. Are you? Margaret asked. Better? Lucia was quiet for a moment, still moving Margaret's arm in gentle circles. Some days. The work matters, you know? It's just different from what I imagined. Ethan watched this exchange from his office, ostensibly listening to his CFO present the quarterly financials, actually completely absorbed in a conversation happening 40 miles away between his mother and a woman who had no idea she was being observed. The jealousy surprised him with its intensity. He had no right to it, he knew. He was the one who had chosen distance. He was the one who had installed cameras instead of pulling up a chair. But watching Margaret respond to Lucia, watching his mother's face animate in ways it hadn't in months, Ethan felt something ugly and possessive twist in his stomach. That was his mother. His relationship. His responsibility. Except he hadn't been responsible, had he? He had been absent. Present only through surveillance, connected only through screens, protecting himself from the pain of watching her suffer by refusing to actually watch it all. The anger came next, though Ethan couldn't identify what exactly he was angry about. Lucia hadn't done anything wrong. She was doing her job, doing it better than anyone else he'd hired. Margaret was clearly happier, more engaged, more alive. That was what he'd wanted, wasn't it? His mother's well-being? But late at night, alone in his apartment, Scrolling through that day's footage, Ethan felt the anger anyway. Directionless. Causeless. A rage at the universe for creating a situation where a stranger could reach his mother more easily than her own son could. A week passed. Then two. Ethan's scrutiny became something else. Something he didn't want to examine too closely. He found himself checking the feed more frequently, not looking for problems but simply looking. Watching the small moments. Lucia reading aloud from the newspaper, doing terrible voice impersonations for different columnists that made Margaret laugh. The two of them working on a jigsaw puzzle, Lucia holding pieces up for Margaret to direct where they should go. Lucia teaching Margaret a card game that required only one hand, the two of them playing for hours, Margaret's competitive streak emerging from hibernation. And the music. Lucia played music constantly. Not just as background noise but as conversation starter, memory trigger, emotional landscape. She'd pull up recordings on her phone and ask Margaret to identify the composer, the piece, the era. Margaret got most of them right, her musical knowledge untouched by the stroke that had stolen so much else. One afternoon, Ethan watched Lucia wheel Margaret into the sunroom. The piano sat in the corner where Ethan had moved it, still covered with a sheet, a monument to loss. Lucia pulled the sheet off without ceremony. "Tell me about this," she said, opening the lid to reveal the keys. Ethan's entire body went rigid. He was in a car, being driven to a meeting in Midtown, but he held up a hand to silence his assistant's briefing and turned the volume up on his phone. Margaret stared at the piano for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet the microphone barely caught it. "I played. I figured," Lucia said. "The calluses on your fingers. The way you move your left hand when you hear certain music." She sat on the piano bench. "Will you teach me something?" "Can't." "Sure you can," Lucia said easily. "You've got a whole working hand. And a brain full of music. I've got two hands that are totally ignorant. Seems like we could figure something out." There was a long silence. "Then, don't know how. Then we'll learn together." Lucia patted the bench beside her. "Come on. Worst case scenario, we make terrible noise and give the neighbors something to complain about." Ethan watched his mother's face. Watched the conflict there, want and fear and grief all visible in her expression. Watched Lucia wait, patient and unbothered, as if she had all the time in the world. Finally Margaret nodded. What followed was halting and imperfect and more beautiful than anything Ethan had heard in months. Lucia's right hand hunting for notes while Margaret's left hand found them with muscle memory. Margaret's voice, slow and slurred but growing stronger, counting beats. The two of them laughing when they lost the rhythm. Starting over. Trying again. Ethan sat in the back of the car, staring at his phone screen, watching his mother play piano again. Watching her be alive. The realization hit him with the force of physical impact. This was what love looked like. Not the surveillance. Not the expensive therapists or the carefully controlled environment or the medical equipment he'd installed. Not the monitoring or the management or the endless, desperate attempt to prevent further loss through sheer force of will. Love looked like sitting beside someone. Like asking their opinion. Like pulling the sheet off the piano and saying let's try. Love looked like presence. And he had been so catastrophically absent. The meeting in Midtown could wait. The acquisition could wait. The empire he'd built and the control he'd maintained and the distance he'd weaponized against his own grief, all of it could wait. Ethan leaned forward. "Turn around," he told the driver. "Take me to Greenwich." "Sir, the meeting?" "Cancel it." He didn't call ahead. Didn't send a message. Just sat in the back of the car, watching the city give way to suburbs. Suburbs give way to the tree-lined streets of Greenwich, driven by something stronger than fear. Driven by the sudden, overwhelming need to stop watching his mother's life through a screen and start participating in it. The car pulled into the driveway. Ethan could hear the piano from outside, the halting melody of two people learning together. He opened the door and walked toward the sound of his mother laughing. The music stopped the moment Ethan opened the front door. He stood in the entryway, his hand still on the doorknob, listening to the sudden silence that had replaced the halting piano melody. Then footsteps, quick and light, coming from the direction of the sunroom. Lucia appeared in the hallway, wiping her hands on her uniform. When she saw him, surprise flickered across her face, followed immediately by something more careful. "Mr. Reynolds," she said. "I wasn't expecting you." Clearly. The word came out sharper than he'd intended. Ethan walked past her toward the sunroom, toward the sound of the piano that had drawn him home like a beacon. Toward his mother. What he saw when he entered stopped him in the doorway. Margaret sat in her wheelchair beside the piano, her left hand resting on the keys. The sheet music was open to a simple beginner's exercise, the kind meant for children just learning to read notes. His mother, who had once played Rachmaninoff from memory, was practicing scales. And Lucia was kneeling on the floor beside her, adjusting the footrest on the wheelchair. Kneeling. Something hot and irrational surged through Ethan's chest. He took 2 steps into the room, his voice cutting through the space with executive precision. "What are you doing?" Lucia looked up, her hands still on the wheelchair mechanism. The footrest was loose. "I'm fixing it." "On your knees?" "Yes." She said it simply, without defensiveness, and somehow that made it worse. "Stand up." For a moment, Lucia didn't move. Then slowly she released the footrest and rose to her feet. She was shorter than he'd realized, maybe 5'3", her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She met his eyes with an expression that was neither defiant nor submissive. "Just steady." "Is there a problem, Mr. Reynolds?" "You're the hired help," Ethan said, the words tasting like ash even as he spoke them. "You don't kneel before her like some kind of—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence because he didn't know what he was accusing her of. Servitude? Devotion? Making him look bad by comparison? Like what? Lucia asked quietly. Ethan gestured at the wheelchair, at his mother sitting silent and watchful between them. "She's your client. There are professional boundaries. Standards of care. You don't—" He searched for the right words. "You don't make yourself subordinate like that." "I was fixing her wheelchair." "You were kneeling." "Because she can't stand." The words hung in the air like a slap. Lucia's voice remained calm, but something had shifted in her posture. A stiffening of her spine. A slight lift of her chin. The footrest needed adjustment. "She's in the wheelchair. I could either ask her to transfer to another chair while I fixed it, which would be uncomfortable and unnecessary, or I could kneel down and fix it where she sat. I chose the option that was easier for her. Your job is to provide care, not to—" "Not to what?" Now there was an edge in Lucia's voice. "Not to make her comfortable? Not to treat her like a person instead of a patient? Not to meet her where she is? You're overstepping." "Into what? Basic human decency?" "You've been here 2 weeks, Ethan said, his voice rising despite himself. 2 weeks, and you've decided you know better than the neurologist, the therapist, the care plan I've spent months." "The care plan you watch on your phone?" The room went absolutely silent. Ethan stared at Lucia. She stared back, her dark eyes steady and unafraid. Behind her, Margaret made a small sound, almost a gasp, but neither of them looked away from each other. "Excuse me?" Ethan said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You heard me." Lucia crossed her arms. "You want to talk about professional boundaries? About appropriate care? Let's talk about the fact that you haven't actually sat with your mother for more than 10 minutes since I started working here. Let's talk about how you call every other day to check in with me, but you never asked to speak to her. Let's talk about how you monitor and manage and control everything from 40 miles away, but you never actually show up." "You have no idea." "I have every idea," Lucia interrupted. "I've worked with families like yours before. Families who hire people like me to do the loving because they're too scared or too busy or too guilty to do it themselves. You pay me to be present so you don't have to be." The truth of it hit Ethan like a physical blow. He took a step back, his hands clenching at his sides. "You're out of line." "Maybe," Lucia said. "But someone needs to say it. Your mother is in there, Mr. Reynolds. She's still in there. She's smart and funny and opinionated, and she loves music, and she has thoughts about everything from politics to the weather. But you wouldn't know that because you don't talk to her. You talk about her. To doctors. To therapists. To me. Never to her. I'm protecting her." "From what?" "What? Connection? Her own son." Ethan's control, the careful emotional regulation that had served him through decades of high-stakes negotiations, finally cracked. "I'm protecting myself." The words tore out of him raw and ugly. "I'm protecting myself from watching her disappear. From sitting beside her while she struggles to form sentences that used to flow like music. From seeing what the stroke took from her every single day until there's nothing left to take." "Is that what you want to hear? That I'm a coward? Fine. I'm a coward. But at least I'm honest about what I can't handle." "Are you?" Lucia's voice was softer now, but no less cutting. "Because from where I'm standing, you're handling it by installing cameras." The world tilted. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. "What?" "The cameras," Lucia repeated. She gestured vaguely at the room around them. "In the smoke detector. In the picture frame by the window. In the outlet by the bookshelf. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" I've worked in enough homes to recognize surveillance when I see it. That's for security, Ethan said automatically, the lie tasting like poison. In case of falls, medical emergencies. Stop. Lucia held up a hand. Just stop. We both know what those cameras are for. They're so you can watch without being seen. So you can monitor without participating. So you can convince yourself you're being a good son while never actually having to be in the room. She took a step toward him, and Ethan had the bizarre urge to step back, to retreat from this small woman who had just dismantled every defense he'd built. Do you watch? She asked quietly. Do you watch the recordings? Ethan said nothing. You do. It wasn't a question. You watch us. You watch her. You watch me help her brush her teeth and get dressed and sit at the table. You watch us play cards and do puzzles and make terrible jokes. You watch all of it from wherever you are, whatever hotel or office or penthouse, and you tell yourself that's enough. That observation equals presence. That monitoring equals love. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell you the truth? Someone has to, Mr. Reynolds, because clearly no one else will. You're not protecting your mother with those cameras. You're protecting yourself. And in the process, you're making her a prisoner in her own home. Making both of us prisoners. Lucia's voice shook slightly on the last words. She uncrossed her arms, her hands falling to her sides, and for the first time since the conversation began, she looked less angry than hurt. I came into this house every day, she said, and I tried to give your mother what she needed. Dignity. Companionship. A reason to wake up in the morning. And the whole time you were watching. Evaluating. Judging. Like I was performing for you instead of caring for her. That's not. It is. Lucia's eyes were bright now, though whether with tears or rage Ethan couldn't tell. Every private moment. Every conversation. Every time I helped her in the bathroom or got her dressed or held her hand when she was frustrated, you were there. Watching. Do you have any idea how violated that makes me feel? How violated it would make her feel if she knew? Behind them, Margaret made a sound. A word maybe, though neither of them could make it out. Ethan looked at his mother for the first time since the argument began. She was gripping the arm of her wheelchair with her left hand, her face pale, her eyes moving between her son and her caregiver like someone watching a car accident in slow motion. Something in her expression broke him. Lucia, he started, his voice hoarse. I didn't mean. Yes, you did, she said quietly. You meant all of it. The cameras. The distance. The control. You made deliberate choices, Mr. Reynolds. And now I'm making one. She walked past him toward the hallway. Ethan turned, watching her go, his mind suddenly blank with panic. Where are you going? Lucia paused in the doorway. She didn't turn around. To get my things. I'll stay until you find a replacement. Professional courtesy. But I'm done, Mr. Reynolds. I won't work in a home where I'm being surveilled. And I won't be complicit in keeping your mother isolated from the one person who should be here. Lucia, wait. I'll be gone by the end of the week. I suggest you start making calls. She disappeared into the hallway. A moment later, Ethan heard her footsteps on the stairs, heading up to the small bedroom where she stayed during her shifts. He stood frozen in the sunroom, the silence pressing against his eardrums like water. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of his mother's breathing. The creak of her wheelchair as she shifted her weight. He had installed cameras to maintain control. He had hired caregivers to maintain distance. He had built an entire system designed to keep him safe from the reality of his mother's condition. And now the only person who had managed to bring Margaret back to life was walking out the door. Ethan turned to his mother. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. Not anger exactly. Not disappointment. Something more complicated. Something that looked almost like pity. Mom, he said, his voice breaking on the word. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Margaret's left hand lifted slightly from the wheelchair arm. An aborted gesture. A question she couldn't quite form. Upstairs, a door closed. Ethan looked at the ceiling, at the direction Lucia had gone, and realized with sudden, terrible clarity that he was about to lose more than his mother's caregiver. He was about to lose his last chance to learn how to be present for the person who mattered most. The piano sat silent. The cameras watched everything. And Ethan stood alone in the ruins of his carefully constructed control, finally understanding what it had cost him. Everything. Ethan caught up with Lucia on the stairs. She had made it halfway up when he called her name, his voice raw in a way he didn't recognize. She stopped but didn't turn around, her hand resting on the banister, her shoulders rigid. Please, Ethan said. Don't go. I already explained. I know. He took 2 steps up, closing the distance but not touching her. I know what you said. You're right. About all of it. The cameras, the distance, the cowardice. You're right. Lucia turned slowly. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, her expression guarded. Then you understand why I can't stay. I do. Ethan's hands were shaking. He shoved them in his pockets. But I'm asking you to anyway. Not for me. For her. That's not fair. No, it's not. He laughed, a broken sound. Nothing about this is fair. But she needs you, Lucia. In 2 weeks, you've given her more than I've managed in 6 months. More than any of the others. You see her. Not the stroke, not the disability, not the loss. Her. And whose fault is it that no one else did? Lucia's voice was sharp. You hired people to manage a medical condition. I'm caring for a person. There's a difference. I know. Do you? She descended 1 step, bringing them eye level. Because I don't think you do, Mr. Reynolds. I think you've spent 6 months convinced that loving your mother means preventing her death. That if you monitor enough, control enough, manage enough, you can keep her safe from further loss. But that's not love. That's terror masquerading as responsibility. The words hit like bullets. Ethan felt his throat constrict, felt something fundamental beginning to crack inside his chest. I watched my father die, he said quietly. 7 years ago. Lung cancer. He went from diagnosis to hospice in 4 months. He looked past Lucia, at nothing, at the memory of a hospital room that smelled like death and disinfectant. I was with him at the end. Held his hand. Watched him take his last breath. And when it was over, when he was gone, I looked at my mother and I saw her future. Alone. Aging. Mortal. Lucia's expression softened slightly, but she didn't speak.
Upload it to my secure server. Then wipe the phone. Dominic was already moving toward the back exit. The police can't find us here. Not together. Not with my history. Mara did as he said. Fingers flying over the phone screen. Upload. Wipe. Factory reset. By the time they reached the service exit, the phone was clean and the recording was safely stored in a server farm she'd never be able to locate. They emerged into an alley as police flooded the courthouse's front entrance. Dominic led her through a series of backstreets, moving like he'd planned this route days ago. Maybe he had. Maybe he always had escape routes mapped in his head. They reached a different car, older, nondescript, keys under the mat. Dominic drove this time, his wounded side making him wince with every turn but his hands steady on the wheel. Mara sat beside him, her broken arm throbbing, her ears still ringing from the gunshot. Did I kill him? She asked quietly. No. You missed by 2 feet. Good. Mara looked at her hands. They weren't shaking. I didn't want to kill him. I wanted him to see that I wasn't afraid anymore. Mission accomplished. They drove in silence for a while. Mara watched the city pass outside the window, thinking about Aaron running through a condemned courthouse, thinking about the recording now in federal hands through channels she didn't understand, thinking about what came next. What happens now, she asked. Aaron will be found. Or he won't. Either way, the recording destroys his credibility. The feds will have to reevaluate his testimony. My lawyers will have ammunition. The Volkovs will realize he's more liability than asset. Dominic glanced at her. You'll be safe. That was the deal. And you. I survive. I always do. But his voice was tired. The wound in his side was bleeding again, fresh blood seeping through the bandages Mara had applied. There's an apartment. Safe house downtown. Doctor who owes me favors will meet us there. You can stay as long as you need. And then you choose. New identity, new life. Far away from all of this. Or. Dominic paused. You stay. Help me finish what Elena and Lena started. Take down the corruption they died trying to expose. Mara looked at him. This man who'd broken down her door because a dead woman's phone had rung. Who'd carried her out of hell and given her weapons instead of protection. Who'd been shot defending her and still offered her freedom. I'm staying, she said. You understand what that means. It means I stop being afraid. It means I use everything Aaron taught me about manipulation and evidence and lying, and I turn it against people who deserve it. Mara met Dominic's eyes. It means I'm not owned. I'm aligned. Something that might have been a smile touched Dominic's mouth. Elena would have liked you. I would have liked her too. They pulled into an underground garage. The doctor was waiting, an older man with steady hands and no questions. He looked at Dominic's wound at Mara's casted arm, and just gestured them inside. The apartment was small but secure. While the doctor worked on Dominic, Mara stood at the window watching the city lights. Somewhere out there, Aaron was running. The Volkovs were regrouping. Federal agents were processing a recording that would change everything. And she was here. Not hiding. Not running. Not afraid. She thought about the text she'd sent 6 days ago. A wrong number. A dead woman's phone. A mistake that had destroyed her life and saved it simultaneously. Dominic appeared beside her, freshly bandaged, moving carefully but alive. "Regret it yet?" he asked. Mara thought about her broken arm. About the courthouse. About pulling a trigger for the first time in her life. About choosing war over peace. "The message was a mistake," she said quietly. "The war was not." Dominic nodded once. Looked out at the city with her. Two people bound by violence and loss and the strange alchemy that turns victims into something harder. Something that survives. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, Mara stood beside a man who'd lost everything and found purpose in revenge. She wasn't his weapon. She wasn't his possession. She was something Aaron had never let her be. She was her own. And that was enough.
Then the stroke happened, Ethan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. And I realized I was watching her die too. Just slower. More cruel. Not all at once but piece by piece. The music first, then her independence, then her voice. And I thought, he stopped, swallowed hard. I thought if I could just control the environment, manage the care, prevent any further damage, maybe I could stop it. Maybe I could keep her frozen at this level of loss instead of losing more. But that's not living, Lucia said gently. I know. Ethan's eyes burned. But losing her is the only thing I'm more afraid of than loving her. The confession hung between them, ugly and honest and devastating. Lucia studied his face for a long moment. Then she sighed, a sound full of exhaustion and something that might have been compassion. You're already losing her, Mr. Reynolds. Every day you choose the cameras over the chair beside her bed. Every day you watch instead of stay. The stroke took her hand in her speech, but you're taking something worse. You're taking her son. I don't know how to stop. Yes, you do. Lucia descended another step. You're just too scared to try. What if I can't do it? The question came out broken, desperate. What if I sit beside her and I can't handle it? What if I look at her and all I see is everything she's lost? What if I'm not strong enough? Strength isn't pretending the loss doesn't exist, Lucia said. It's sitting with it anyway. It's choosing presence over protection. It's being human with another human instead of treating them like a problem to solve. Ethan closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw his mother's face on the camera feed. Saw her sitting alone by the window. Saw her reaching for piano keys with a hand that no longer obeyed. Saw her waiting, always waiting for a son who never came. I don't know how to be what she needs. Then learn. Lucia's voice was firm now, almost stern. Stop monitoring and start participating. Stop managing and start feeling. Stop protecting yourself and start loving her. What if it's too late? It's not. Lucia glanced back toward the sunroom, where Margaret sat alone in her wheelchair, caught between a son who couldn't stay and a caregiver who wouldn't. But it will be if you keep choosing distance. Ethan opened his eyes. Looked at this woman who had known his mother for 2 weeks and understood her better than he did after 47 years. What do I do? You really want to know? He nodded. Lucia turned and walked back down the stairs. Ethan followed, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hands still shaking in his pockets. They walked through the hallway, past the rooms he'd transformed into a care facility, toward the sunroom where his mother waited. Margaret looked up when they entered. Her eyes moved from Lucia to Ethan, fear and hope warring in her expression. Lucia walked to the wheelchair and knelt, deliberately, Ethan realized, making a point, beside Margaret. Your son wants to try something, she said gently. Are you okay with that? Margaret's gaze shifted to Ethan. She nodded once, slowly. Lucia stood and turned to face him. Sit, she said simply. Ethan frowned. What? Sit. On the floor. Beside her wheelchair. I don't understand. You've been looking down at her for 6 months, Lucia interrupted. From hospital beds and wheelchairs and every elevated position that reinforces the idea that she's diminished. So sit. Get on her level. Look at her eye to eye instead of patient to caregiver. Ethan stared at the floor. At the polished hardwood that had been in his family home for 3 generations. At the space beside his mother's wheelchair where Lucia was telling him to lower himself. Every instinct screamed against it. He was Ethan Reynolds. He stood. He commanded. He controlled. He didn't kneel. Didn't sit on floors. Didn't make himself small or vulnerable or subordinate. But none of that had brought his mother back. None of that had made her laugh. None of that had given her a reason to reach for the piano keys again. Slowly, feeling ridiculous and terrified and somehow right, Ethan lowered himself to the floor. The hardwood was cold against his palms as he settled into a sitting position, his back against the wall, his legs stretched out in front of him. From this angle his mother seemed taller. Present. Real in a way she hadn't been through a camera screen. Margaret was looking at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Surprise maybe. Or wonder. Her left hand trembled slightly on the wheelchair arm. Now what? Ethan asked, his voice rough. Now talk to her, Lucia said from somewhere behind him. Not about her care plan or her medication or her therapy schedule. About anything else. About nothing. About everything. Just talk. Ethan looked up at his mother. She looked down at him. The position reversal felt strange, wrong, and somehow exactly right. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Margaret's mouth moved. Worked. Finally shaped words. Hi. Ethan. 2 words. Slurred and slow and the most beautiful thing he'd heard in months. Hi, Mom. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Margaret's hand lifted from the wheelchair arm, reaching toward him with obvious effort. Ethan took it without thinking, felt her fingers curl around his with surprising strength. Her skin was cool and papery and alive. I'm sorry, he said, the words tumbling out. I'm so sorry I haven't been here. I'm sorry I've been watching instead of sitting. I'm sorry I turned your home into a hospital and your life into something to manage. I'm sorry I've been so goddamn scared that I forgot you're still here. Margaret's grip tightened. A single tear tracked down her cheek. I miss you, Ethan continued, his own eyes burning now. I miss talking to you. I miss hearing about your day. I miss... His voice broke. I miss you playing piano. I miss the music. I miss the person you were before the stroke, and I've been so angry at the universe for taking that from you that I couldn't see the person you still are. Still, here, Margaret said, her voice barely audible. I know you are. And I'm here too. Finally. Terribly. Completely here. From across the room, Lucia moved quietly. Ethan heard a drawer open, the soft sound of music beginning. The tinny melody of the music box filled the sunroom. Margaret's eyes widened. Her mouth shaped a word, your father. Yeah. Ethan's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. Lucia found it. She played it for you. Made me cry. Me too, Ethan admitted. When I saw you crying on the camera, he stopped, swallowed. I left a meeting. Drove here. Because I couldn't stand watching you hurt from 40 miles away anymore. Margaret's hand trembled in his. Cameras. I'm sorry, he said again. I installed them because I was afraid. I thought if I could see you all the time I could keep you safe. But all I did was make you a prisoner. Make both of us prisoners. Take them down. I will. Today. All of them. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. No more watching. Just being here. Margaret nodded. Then with visible effort she spoke again, scared, too. Of what? Being burden. Being broken. The words shattered something in Ethan's chest. He shifted closer, still holding her hand, his voice fierce and certain. You're not broken. You're different. Changed. But not broken. Never broken. Can't play anymore. I watched you, Ethan said. Earlier with Lucia. I watched you play with one hand and Mom, it was beautiful. Different, yes. But beautiful. One hand. So, you've got one hand and a lifetime of music in your head. That's more than most people have. He smiled through tears. And you've got Lucia, who's apparently willing to fumble through melodies with you. And you've got me if you'll let me stay. Margaret's face crumpled. Stay. I will. I promise. No more running. No more hiding behind cameras and caregivers and control. I'm staying. The music box played its simple melody. Lucia had moved to the far corner of the room, giving them space, giving them privacy for the first time in months that wasn't mediated by screens. Ethan sat on the floor beside his mother's wheelchair, holding her hand, feeling her pulse against his palm. The position was uncomfortable, undignified, completely inappropriate for a CEO worth $9 billion. And he had never felt more right in his life. "Tell me something," he said quietly. "Something you've wanted to say but couldn't because I haven't been here to listen." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Her eyes drifted to the piano, to the keys she could no longer fully play. Then back to her son sitting on the floor below her. "Music helps," she said slowly. "Makes me remember why still am." "Then we'll play music," Ethan said. "Every day. As much as you want. We'll sit here and listen together." "You're busy?" "Not anymore. Not for this. Never too busy for this." Margaret's thumb moved against his hand, a small gesture that felt enormous. "Lonely," she whispered. "Was so lonely." The confession broke him completely. Ethan pressed his forehead against their joined hands and let himself cry. For his mother's loneliness. For his father's absence. For 6 months of surveillance that had prevented the only thing that mattered, connection. He cried for the time he'd wasted and the fear he'd weaponized and the love he'd withheld because he was too terrified of losing more. And his mother, who had every right to be angry, who had every reason to reject this late and inadequate attempt at presence, simply held his hand and waited. The music box wound down. The melody slowed, then stopped. In the silence that followed, Ethan lifted his head. His mother was smiling at him, crooked, incomplete, but real. "Stay," she said again. "I'm staying," Ethan promised. "I'm right here." And he was. Long after the music ended, long after Lucia quietly left the room, long after his legs went numb from sitting on the hard floor, Ethan stayed. He stayed because presence was harder than surveillance but infinitely more valuable. He stayed because his mother was still here, still alive, still herself beneath the losses. He stayed because love wasn't about preventing pain but sitting with it. He stayed because, for the first time in 6 months, he had finally come home. The cameras came down on a Tuesday. Ethan did it himself, methodically working through each room with a screwdriver and a stepladder. The one in the smoke detector. The one hidden in the picture frame. The one disguised as an outlet by the bookshelf. He found 7 in total, though he'd only remembered installing 5. Each time he pulled one free, he felt something loosen in his chest. A knot unwinding. A grip releasing. Margaret watched from her wheelchair as he removed the final camera from the sunroom. When he climbed down and showed it to her, she looked at the small device for a long moment, then met his eyes. "Good," she said clearly. It was the longest word she'd spoken in days without struggling. Ethan dropped the camera in the box with the others. "I'm sorry I put them there in the first place." "I know." Margaret's left hand gestured toward the box. "Trash." "Trash," Ethan confirmed. Then he paused. "Unless you want me to keep one. For actual security. In a visible place. Your choice." Margaret considered this, her face thoughtful in a way that reminded him painfully of the woman she'd been before the stroke. The professor who would weigh both sides of an argument before committing to a position. "One," she said finally. "Front hall. Where I can see it." "Done." Ethan carried the box out to the garage and dropped it in the trash bin, keeping only the single camera she'd approved. As the lid closed on the rest, he felt lighter than he had in months. When he returned to the house, Lucia was in the kitchen making tea. "All gone?" she asked without turning around. "All gone." Ethan leaned against the doorframe. "I wanted to say thank you. For calling me out. For staying even after." He stopped. "For staying." Lucia set the kettle on the stove and turned to face him. "I almost didn't." "I know. I had my bag packed. I was ready to walk out and never come back." She crossed her arms, not defensively but thoughtfully. "But then I heard you on the stairs. Heard the way your voice broke when you said please. And I realized you weren't just asking me to stay for Margaret. You were asking me to stay because you didn't know how to do this alone." "I don't," Ethan admitted. "I have no idea what I'm doing." "That's okay. Neither did I at first." Lucia smiled slightly. "Your mother is the 4th stroke patient I've worked with. The other 3 had families who treated me like a service provider. Instructions, schedules, reports. Very professional. Very distant. You're the first one who's ever actually admitted he's afraid. Does it get easier? The fear? No." Lucia shook her head. "But you get better at sitting with it. Better at accepting that you can't control everything. Better at being present even when presence is painful." The kettle began to whistle. Lucia turned back to the stove, poured hot water over tea bags, and handed one mug to Ethan. "I'm starting therapy," he said abruptly. "Actual therapy." Not just grief counseling after my father died, but regular sessions. Dr. Chin recommended someone who specializes in family dynamics and caregiver stress. Lucia's eyebrows rose. That's good. I called this morning. First appointment is Friday. Ethan wrapped his hands around the warm mug. She asked me what brought me in. I told her I'd spent 6 months watching my mother through cameras instead of sitting beside her, and I needed to understand why I thought that was acceptable. What did she say? That we'd have a lot to talk about. Lucia laughed softly. I bet. They stood in the kitchen, drinking tea in companionable silence. Through the doorway, Ethan could hear his mother humming in the sunroom, a melody he didn't recognize but that sounded almost happy. She's been doing that more, Lucia said, following his gaze. Humming. Singing little pieces of songs. Her speech therapist says it's actually good for her recovery. Music and language are processed in different parts of the brain, so sometimes melody can unlock words that feel stuck. I didn't know that. Most people don't. Lucia sipped her tea. But Margaret does. She told me about it last week when we were working on her exercises. Took her 10 minutes to explain it, but she got every word out. She's so much smarter than people give her credit for. I know, Ethan said quietly. I forgot for a while. But I know. The shifts came gradually, not all at once. Ethan started working from home 3 days a week, setting up his laptop in the sunroom while Margaret did her exercises with Lucia. At first, he tried to maintain his usual schedule, back-to-back meetings, urgent emails, the constant demands of running a company worth billions. But then Margaret would make a sound, a small laugh or grunt of frustration, and he'd look up from his screen. And looking up meant seeing. Seeing meant connecting. Connecting meant closing the laptop and moving to sit beside her wheelchair. Am I interrupting? Margaret asked the third time this happened. No, Ethan said. I meant it. He started delegating more. Trusting his COO to handle acquisitions. Letting his team make decisions without his constant oversight. The company didn't collapse. In fact, his assistant reported that several executives seemed relieved to have more autonomy. Turns out, Ethan told his therapist, I'm not as indispensable as I thought. Dr. Reeves, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and an unsettling ability to see through his defenses, smiled. How does that feel? Terrifying, Ethan admitted. And freeing. Can it be both? Apparently. In their sessions, they talked about control and grief and the ways his father's death had shaped his response to his mother's stroke. They talked about masculinity and the toxic idea that protection meant emotional distance. They talked about the cameras. You said you installed them to keep her safe, Dr. Reeves noted during their 4th session. But what were you really afraid of? Ethan sat with the question for a long time. I was afraid of not being enough. Of failing her the way I felt I failed my father. He died and I couldn't stop it. I thought if I monitored my mother closely enough, controlled every variable, I could prevent further loss. But you can't prevent loss. No, I can't. The admission hurt less than he'd expected. All I can do is be present while it happens. And hope that presence is enough. Is it? Dr. Reeves asked. Enough. Ethan thought about his mother's hand in his. About sitting on the floor of the sunroom. About the way her face lit up when he walked into a room now instead of just watching through a screen. Yes, he said. I think it is. Margaret's physical recovery was slow and incremental. Her right hand remained weak, her speech still labored. But something else improved. Something the neurologists couldn't measure but Lucia and Ethan both noticed. She smiled more. Laughed more. Engaged more. Depression is common in stroke patients, her speech therapist explained during a checkup. Especially when they feel isolated or believe they're a burden. But Margaret's effect has improved significantly in the last month. Whatever you're doing differently, keep doing it. What they were doing differently was simple. They were present. Ethan sat with his mother every evening, sometimes talking, sometimes just listening to music. Lucia taught him how to help with exercises, how to spot signs of fatigue, how to celebrate small victories like Margaret managing to button her own shirt or use a fork with her left hand. These aren't nothing, Lucia reminded him when he expressed frustration at the pace of progress. These are everything. Ethan started redefining success. Not as preventing further loss, but as finding joy within the current reality. Not as fixing his mother, but as loving her exactly as she was. He also started redefining masculinity. For 47 years, he'd equated strength with control, power with emotional distance, success with never showing weakness. But sitting on the floor with his mother, admitting his fear to Lucia, crying in therapy, These felt stronger than any boardroom negotiation he'd ever executed. Real strength, Dr. Reeves said, is being vulnerable enough to connect. That's harder than any amount of surveillance or control. No wonder I avoided it for so long, Ethan said wryly. Most people do. But you're here now. That's what matters. On a Saturday morning in late spring, Ethan walked into the sunroom and found his mother at the piano. She was seated in her wheelchair, positioned at an angle that allowed her left hand to reach the keys. Lucia sat on the bench beside her, playing the right-hand melody while Margaret managed the left-hand harmony. The piece was simple, a children's song about sunshine and birds, but they played it together, halting and imperfect and beautiful. Ethan stood in the doorway watching. Not through a screen this time. Not from 40 miles away. Just watching, present here. When the song ended, Margaret looked up and saw him. Her face broke into a smile. Ethan, she said. Not a struggle. Not a strain. Just his name, spoken with love. That was beautiful, Mom. Come, sit. And he did. Ethan crossed the room and sat on the floor beside her wheelchair, in the spot that had become his over the past month. From this angle, he could see her face clearly, could hold her hand, could be eye level with the woman who had given him life and was teaching him how to live it properly. Lucia played a few more notes, then quietly excused herself. I'll make tea. When they were alone, Margaret's hand found Ethan's. She held it with her left hand, the strong one, and looked at him with an expression that held everything: gratitude, love, forgiveness, hope. Staying? She asked. It was the question she'd asked a month ago, when he first sat on this floor and promised not to run anymore. She asked it now not because she doubted, but because she needed to hear the answer again. Needed the reassurance that presence was permanent, not temporary. I'm staying, Ethan said. And then because it needed to be said, not watching, not monitoring, not controlling, just staying. Here. With you. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Love you. I love you too, Mom. So much. They sat together in the sunroom, hand in hand, while morning light filtered through the windows and dust motes danced in the air. No cameras watched them. No screens mediated their connection. No fear separated son from mother. Outside birds sang. Inside, a music box sat silent on the shelf, waiting to be played when they needed it. But for now this was enough. This was everything. Ethan had spent 6 months trying to protect his mother from further loss by watching from a distance. He'd installed cameras and hired caregivers and maintained control because he believed that was love. But he'd been wrong. Love wasn't proven by watching. It was proven by staying. By sitting on hard floors and holding trembling hands and being present for both the victories and the struggles. By showing up even when it hurt. By choosing connection over protection. By being vulnerable enough to admit fear and strong enough to sit with it anyway. His mother would continue to face challenges. Her recovery would be incomplete. There would be hard days and setbacks and moments when the losses felt unbearable. But Ethan would be there. Not through a camera. Not from 40 miles away. Not hidden behind the safety of surveillance and control. He would be there on the floor at her level, holding her hand. Staying. Finally, truly, completely staying. And that, he was learning, was the only protection that mattered. The only love worth giving. The only way to be a son.